Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Today we are continuing where we left off last time with a summary analysis for verses 21 through 39, I believe. We didn't get all the way through, so I figured we'll dedicate another session to analysis. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. So I guess I'll give a brief overview first. So we've discussed how the surah starts with introducing itself as the book in which there is no doubt a guidance for the wary. Then it talks about this party who it guides, the wary, those who it doesn't guide, who are the deniers, who reject guidance basically, therefore they do not receive it. And then those who basically pretend to receive it but actually don't follow it, which are the hypocrites. Then 21 was our transition point. O you people, serve your Lord who created you and those before you, that you may beware. Oh, I should be sharing here. That you may beware. So it presents serving God as the obvious response to reality, which it is. The reality of you, your creation, the world around you, the sky above you, the water that comes down from the sky, the food that comes out from the earth. So serve that entity, don't make rivals for him. There's the discussion of being in doubt about this book, which remember had been introduced as the book in which there is no doubt. The first sort of mention of the fire and the gardens beneath which rivers flow as destinations, heaven and hell basically, dependent upon denial or belief, you could say, and righteous work. Discussion of like how God is striking likenesses, gives an example of a mosquito, and talks about how these examples lead astray many and guide many, but only lead astray the defiant. And we talked about last time especially how in this verse, like it's phrased like, what did God wish by this example? So it's like God, the person puts themselves above God. They like judge downwards towards the example rather than letting the example guide them. So if it's an insignificant example to them of a mosquito, it's like beneath them basically. And here the idea is that they don't let God's guidance be above them and they follow God's guidance. Rather, they put the guidance beneath them, and they as if they have a degree over it and they judge over God's guidance. But if you put yourself above God's guidance, then you're no longer following guidance. You're imposing for the guidance to follow you, if that makes sense, or your desires above. some discussion about the covenant, sort of the pledge of God, which also I think connects to worshiping Him alone. Discussion about how you have no right to deny God on the basis of having been dead and brought to life and your inevitable death. And from both of those, your implied inevitable return. And His creation of, besides you, once again, everything on the earth and the sky, which is actually the same pattern that we saw just a bit earlier. Worship your Lord who created you and those before you, who made the earth for you a spread and the sky a building. So it's you, it goes from your creation, the earth, which is the world around you, and the heaven, which is the sky above you. And we see the same pattern or sequence in verse 29, 29, where it says, it discusses about your bringing to life and death, and then He is the one who created for you what is in the earth. Furthermore, He even to the sky and even them as 7 heavens. Then, of course, this is the part that we didn't discuss so much last time. I think verse 30 onwards, the story of man's creation, originally with Adam. But this is, I guess, what we'll look in more detail today, God willing. Which basically encompasses God's intent to make Adam a successor on earth. The angels protest against that, teaching Adam the names, questioning the angels who are unaware of the names, basically, are unable to know them except unless they're explicitly taught. And Adam's ability to teach the angels, etc. The command to prostrate to Adam, disobeying of Iblis. Adam's, mistake in the garden, if you will, and the descent to earth in which God gives the binary sort of destinations of heaven and hell, basically, on the basis of whether or not one follows God's guidance when it comes to them. And this becomes the general rule, of which the Qur'an is one manifestation. So now I'll go to the ChatGPT window. I did refine slightly the analysis here from last time. So we're starting with verse 21, 22. O people, serve your Lord who created you and those before you, that you may become wary. Remember that the book had started by saying that is the book in which there is no doubt, guidance for the wary. So we have 3 concepts here connecting: guidance, wariness, taqwa, and serving your Lord, which is to say Islam, basically submission to God, serving Him alone. So you must serve your Lord. In other words, you must submit to Him in order to be wary. Wa alaikum salam. Welcome. By the way, StreamYard link is in the chat. Anyone wanting to join? So actually, basically, like, it makes an interesting summary here. Assalamu alaikum, Sister Meow, welcome. So you have these three concepts: wariness, guidance, and serving your Lord, which are all three connected. Yes, of course, you can share something. The book is guidance for the wary. That's how it starts, the surah. But also serve your Lord that you may be wary is how this section starts. Serve your Lord so you may become wary. So if you kind of combine these, you can take some more information. As it says here, you can say, the book is guidance for the wary. How do you become wary? Verse 21 gives the answer. It says, serve your Lord, who created you and those before you, that you may be wary, or beware. Be amongst the wary. So you could also say, therefore, you must serve your Lord in order to be guided, because the book is guidance for the wary. So being wary is a precondition of guidance. Serving your Lord is a precondition of being wary. And it summarizes these three key terms: submission or servitude describes yielding oneself to God. Wariness describes carefully remaining aligned with His authority. It's kind of deeper than that, I think. And finally, guidance describes God directing the servant into and along that alignment. Then we have, so if you're in doubt of what we brought down upon our servant, then bring a surah like it and call your witnesses from besides God if you are honest. So recalling, the surah starts with saying that is the book in which there is no doubt. And now we're asked if we are in doubt. So it makes the summary here, which is a good point. There is no doubt in the book, but there can be doubt in the people. So you have a subjective doubt in the face of objective certainty of the guidance. And then just considering, I had to go a bit through the surah to get a better overview here. But to produce a surah like it, which is the challenge of that verse, while the surah presents itself as guidance from God, answer to prayer for guidance for the upright path, a discourse producing wariness or awareness, comprehensive description of true orientation, etc. And then, bigger than that, the whole surah as it unfolds is like communicating a singular message of like an orientation of submission in terms of all sorts of different terminology and examples. It summarizes some of them here, like some of the spheres: theology, psychology, parable, creation, history, covenant, law, worship, economics, family. Later in part 2 of the surah, kind of conflict, repentance, resurrection. And all of these categories communicate the same message of this orientation of submission, if you will. It says, once the challenge is posed and their incapacity is declared, continued doubt is exposed as something more than innocent uncertainty. It becomes resistance to the guidance and therefore denial. Another thing here in this section, but I'll pause actually if there are any thoughts on the verses. Okay, if not, continuing a bit. So there's multiple mentions of wariness up to where we've come. The initial one, starting the surah, that is the book in which there is no doubt, guidance for the wary. And then we had verse 21, serve your Lord who created you and those before you that you may become wary. And finally, if you're in doubt of it, etc., bring a surah like it. If you do not, then beware the fire. So you may become wary of God through serving Him, as verse 21 says. Then the book will be guidance for you, and you would be thereby protected from the fire. But those who refuse the first wariness, meaning to become wary of God through serving Him, are confronted with the second. Basically, the dichotomy is like beware of God and submit now, or beware of the consequence of refusing Him. Any thoughts connected to these ideas? Then it discusses a bit about the mosquito example. This was the key point, I think, which it picks up on. The misguided response to the example is the ones who ask, what did God intend by this example? Here the point is they position their judgment above God's speech. Instead of being judged by the sign, they attempt to judge the sign. This is already, it says, an Iblis-like posture. God's command or sign is evaluated by the creature's independent standard, rather than the creature subjecting themselves to that standard. It's pretty much the difference between submission and defiance. And actually, yeah, interesting that I said that, because at the end of the verse, it says, it does not misguide except the defiant. I was not even attempting to connect that. That's pretty deep, actually. Because when you read the verse, it almost seems like an innocent crime. They're just attempting to rationalize the sign. What could be so wrong about that? But it's not so simple. They're placing the sign under them, under their judgment, rather than placing their judgment under God's guidance. So that's actually the difference between submission and defiance. Their misguidance also, it says, is not caused by an obscure example. Their response to the example reveals an already rebellious orientation. Any thoughts connected to this example about the mosquito? Okay. Now verses 28, 29. How can you deny in God while you are dead? So he brought you to life. Furthermore, he caused your death. Furthermore, he brings you to life. Furthermore, to him you are returned. He is the one who created for you the earth, what is in the earth collectively. Furthermore, he leveled to the heaven, so leveled them as 7 heavens, and he is of everything knowing. It says it destroys the illusion that denial creates independence. That's actually a good point, I think, because when it talks about your creation, I mean, you're bringing to life and your death, and you're bringing back to life. It shows that denial is basically not just incoherent, but almost like impossible. Should be impossible, because how to put it? I guess I would say denial is incoherent is the best way I can put it. Incoherent with your origin and your inability to escape in the form of your death, and your further inability to escape and your recreation in the form of the next life. Basically, I would put it this way. If God created you, but if you were to not die in this current life that we're living, then you could effectively deny Him, even though He created you, because you'll be here forever. So you're always going to exist in this state. Therefore, it really doesn't matter. You can deny God. But the fact that you're going to die and return to Him makes it incoherent. And that's how God designed it. So it is incoherent. Anyway, then we get finally to verse 30, the story of Adam. Could you expand on that? What connects directly to the story that follows it? God tests us on earth after our fall by means of our life and death and resurrection, you could say. I think that's fair. So, Iblis refuses, arrogates, becomes among the deniers. Iblis receives a clear command from God but refuses to submit to it. He actually does exactly like what we said in the mosquito section. He places his judgment above God's judgment. Or he places God's guidance beneath himself, rather than placing it above himself and allowing himself to be guided by it. So since he places it beneath himself, that's not just it's not just wrong, it results in misguidance, because if you place God's guidance beneath yourself, then you are no longer able to follow it. Now the guidance is following whatever you want, or you are following whatever you want. How can I put it? Yeah, I kind of lost it, I guess, but it's kind of like since Iblis places his judgment above God's guidance or God's judgment or God's command, however you want to put it, therefore to Iblis, he seems more correct than God from his perspective. But that's not just neutrally. That's because he has placed God's judgment beneath him. So it says it's an archetype behind later forms of misguidance, dismissing God's examples, selectively accepting revelation, preferring inherited identity, treating one's own judgment as the criterion of divine truth. Continuing, or are there any points to add?
Salam, can you hear me?
Yes, Sam.
Similar to what you said, it's like provides like an archetype or an example of something, of a behavior, a mentality to avoid, and a warning for us that lest, if we are wary. But following this section, and this is getting into something I wanted to mention, which I'll wait until you're done, God willing. But like the example of the children of Israel that populates a significant portion of the rest of the surah is similarly an example of not properly subsuming yourself to the guidance, but rather putting yourself above the guidance and thinking you've been guided because you're special. It's a really it's a very nuanced flip that can happen in someone's mind, but it's something very, very concerning, something to be very careful of, which connects back to taqwa effectively. You need to not only recognize, I think, God's superiority in all cases, and recognizing that you are like a fuqara to God, like you are completely in need and God is completely free of need. Where was I going with this? This is what happens when I make these two-part points and I forgot the second part.
Can I add something?
Please go ahead.
So, yes, there's that verse coming up, very important, I think, where it says, وَقَالُوا كُونُوا هُودًا أَوْ نَصَارَى تَهْتَدُوا. And they said, be Jews or Christians that you be guided. So they subject, the Jews and Christians respectively, God's guidance beneath their sect, rather than subject themselves to God's guidance. They put God's guidance under themselves, which is exactly what Iblis did, what the devil did here, which is to say, God's command, he judged it as if it were wrong. The fact that he could judge God's command is already the mistake. He's supposed to let himself be guided by God's command. But as soon as he puts it beneath himself, he's already lost. So if you as a community place God's guidance beneath your community, like it only belongs to your community, or something like that, then already you've similarly lost. Then it compares Adam's failure to, or did you have a point to add, Yeta?
No, later, God willing.
Okay. It compares then Adam's failure to Iblis's failure, which is, I think, important. They both made an error, obviously. However, Adam receives words from his Lord and repents, whereas Iblis maintains arrogant refusal. Doubles down, even, you could say. So Adam receiving words from his Lord and repenting upon him, it says, anticipates the book itself. Humanity's recovery from misguidance also occurs through words from God, basically God's guidance, receptivity to those words, turning back through them, and then God mercifully turning towards the servant. So the book is not only an initial direction, it is also the means by which fallen humanity returns to submission, or even beyond the book, God's guidance is the means by which fallen humanity returns to submission and returns to God by His permission ultimately. Any thoughts on that point? Finally, we get to the key verses, probably one of the most significant verses so far in the surah, the final two of this section, 38 and 39. We said, descend from it collectively, so if comes to you from me guidance, then whoever followed my guidance, there is no fear upon them, and they will not grieve. And those who denied and belied our signs, those are the companions of the fire, they are therein eternal. So, it's a universal promise, obviously, and a universal trajectory. It's not exclusive to the Qur'an, it occurred before the Qur'an, etc., where guidance comes to people from God in various forms, you could even say. Through various messengers, through various revelation, and then that revelation even is received through various means, through hearing about it, through whatever the case, like all sorts of different contexts. But the guidance comes to people. Then whoever follows my guidance, there is no fear upon them, and they will not grieve. And those who deny and belie our verses or our signs, those are the companions of the fire, they're eternal therein. Following God's guidance means aligning what comes from God to determine one's direction. So it makes a contrasting table between some of these terms and cases. Submission, serving God alone, wariness, basically receptiveness, receiving God's words, Adam's return, safety, comparative to refusal of submission or associating partners to God. Denial, I would have said here. Yeah, something like that. And ultimately, the fire instead of safety. Also contrasting Iblis's arrogance versus Adam's repentance.
At at the bottom of your chart, there was a distinction made between safety and fire. And I wanted to ask how you might connect that to the ending of verse 38, which is, there's no fear upon them, nor shall they grieve. And what are the implications of that promise in regards to what we've studied in the surah so far, and perhaps what comes next? Or maybe even in the Quran as a whole. But like, I'm curious how you would connect that or think about that.
What is the significance of the phrase, basically? There's no fear upon them, they will not grieve.
Yeah, or like how it connects Let me give you an example. We have the example of this comes right after the discussion of how Adam and his spouse were expelled from the heaven. Now, that to me seems like a situation that might be one of profound grief and fear. But God reassures them and grants a promise to them and their offspring, basically, their generations that come after them, which is if comes to guidance, if you follow the guidance, I'm paraphrasing, then there's no fear upon them, nor shall they grieve. But on the opposite end, if they don't follow the guidance, then that's where it becomes bad for them. And the guidance is worship God alone, that you will be returned to Him. So it's a very clear and straightforward instruction, and God repeatedly clarifies it for humanity, but they don't really seem to get it a lot of the time. And this revelation itself, being that this is the second surah that comes after Surah 1, that contains the guidance that we're praying for in Surah 1, as of course how God determined it and revealed it, all praise to Him. It is one of those ways for us to be saved from that fear and grief that can surround us on earth if we're not careful. And I just said careful without even intending it. SubhanAllah.
Well, I would maybe take it a bit further, or I would connect specifically, it's about the guidance. So the guidance, just like the surah, kind of, the guidance is following God's guidance is what saves one from fear and grief, is the basic message. So not following God's guidance obviously results in fear and grief. Not just some of the time, but definitionally. So the source of fear and grief is not following God's guidance.
Because it would stand to reason the inverse as well, as you already articulated the inverse. God's guidance is meant to save us from fear and grief. It's like a somewhat binary logic, which I shared with you and a few other people my project about this set of verses, which is very much in its very much in its infancy stages, but
Yeah, well, let me just do a quick search here.
it's the search.
What are common sources of fear and grief in the human experience?
Oh, that's a good one.
Okay, here it is.
Are you by any chance asking the robot about human experience?
Yeah.
It's a joke, sorry.
Technically, it sources its information from human sources.
Well, sorry, can you mute?
Yeah.
It's driving me crazy to hear my voice twice. But the something that I read recently about AI itself being a large language model means that it is simply basically like people that know this far better than I'm saying in a very brutish fashion, but it's meant to be predicting the next most likely word or whatever. So fundamentally what it is it's based off of human language. So this
Yeah.
goes back to the story of Adam that God
And
gave.
it's,
Sorry.
and it's trained on human data. So, like, it's not just a robot. It's literally... Anyway, loss of loved ones, major life changes, physical danger. I think it can do a bit better here, but anyway, physical harm. Well, there's no physical harm if you follow God's guidance. The true physical harm is the fire of hell, basically, constant and eternal physical harm. Anything else is temporary and part of the test of life and a sign of the ultimate condition. Plus, we would not be suffering any pain whatsoever if we had not fallen from the garden, which was a direct result of not following God's guidance. So in any sense you look at it, what we suffer on is a result of not following God's guidance. Secondly, unknown future, it says, this is for fear. Change, failure, and uncertainty causes worry. It's
You know what I'm
kind
thinking?
of, but
This sends us back to Surah Al-Fatiha, like to the very last words of Surah Al-Fatiha. Those who fell astray or caused anger, were angered upon, or fell astray. That is,
I think you cut off towards the end. Could you try one more time, sister?
yes, basically, that story of Adam sends us back directly to the very last words of Surah Al-Fatiha. And while we were discussing about the fall or being angered upon, that essentially is another representation of the story of Adam.
Mm. Sources of fear, just to go a bit further, like it says unknown future. Well, unknown future is like the definition of not having guidance because you don't know your direction. You don't know, you have no reassurance. Therefore, you're in a state of fear because you don't know where you're headed, what's going to happen to you. That's the absence of guidance, kind of by definition. A loss of control. Helplessness, basically. That's basically the tangible form of not having guidance. But anyway, grief, death, and dying. Basically, loss, you could say. Loss is also resulting from not following God's guidance, in the ultimate sense, number one, you lose yourself and your loved ones in the fire if you are not guided and they're not guided. Secondly, you being lost results in grief, I guess. It's kind of a bit of a difficult one because maybe I'll ask the AI more specifically.
You're basically saying that premise for like follow the guidance and you will not be lost, or follow the guidance, yeah, you will not be lost, you will not be feeling lost, you will not grieve.
Yes, and what I'm getting at is like later in this very surah, God talks about like when a disaster strikes them, they say, indeed to God we belong and indeed to him we return. So even in a situation of loss, the person has guidance, therefore they're not despairing, they're not like extremely fearful, extremely grieving, even in this life, because they have that guidance. They know their destination and who they belong to. So it pretty much confirms the point in the sense that the absence of God's guidance is what's causing death and loss and all these things to be so fear and grief inducing. And then when you apply it to the hereafter, it becomes the ultimate form where if you lived your whole life unguided, astray, then your eternal reality becomes fear and grief.
And would it also be connected to that very basic idea that there is no paradise on earth? So we are bound to earth, bound to suffering, sadness, and grief, unless we earn back the right to go to paradise.
Yeah, I think so. And also in other surahs, it was described for Adam how like he will suffer no heat, no discomfort, no hunger, which are all things that we suffer in this life, in this fallen state, so to speak. But the fallen state itself is resulting from Adam not following God's guidance. And then when he sends him down to earth, which is exactly the verses we're on, he gives him the path to get back to no fear and grief. which is following his guidance, obviously. Yeah, sorry. Just wording the thing. So as verse 38 posits that following guidance results in no fear and grief. So one can argue, conversely, that grief and fear result from not following God's guidance. Could you cite classic sources of grief and fear and analyze this logical argument? And then I said also compare that example. When a disaster strikes them, they say, indeed to God we belong and to him we return. Revealing that even death, which is pretty much the most deeply saddening and grieving event in human experience, arguably, seems to lose its force of grief when one is wary of their destination and subservience to God and thus guided. Alaikum salam. So a refusal of God's guidance, it's highly suggested that refusing God's guidance leaves the person exposed to the conditions that generate fear and grief. Whereas guidance changes both one's final outcome and one's interpretation of worldly loss. The Quran itself gathers many of the ordinary cases or causes into 155, that verse that's coming up. I mentioned fear, hunger, loss of wealth, lives, and fruits. So it gives examples that cause fear and grief. The source, death. Then the source of the fear, one's own approaching end. Grief, loss of another person. Loss of wealth, future insecurity and poverty. Grief if that wealth has already disappeared. Hunger, whether one will survive or be provided for. Grief if one has lost their provision. It kind of works predictively and post occurrence, if that makes sense. It actually summarizes the point. It says fear is principally oriented toward what may come, grief toward what has already been lost. Together they cover the human being's temporal vulnerability. Fear of the future and grief over the past. So it makes the argument that following God's guidance secures the person both concerning what lies ahead and what lies behind. It also says a person who treats temporary things as ultimate will necessarily fear losing them and grieve when they are lost. A person oriented toward God understands that possessions were never absolutely his, loved ones belong to God, life itself is entrusted rather than owned, death is not departure from God but return to Him, and worldly loss does not determine the final outcome. So this is basically guidance, which saves one from grief and fear. Oh man, even that passage that I cited later states that it goes like أولئك على هدى من ربهم. No, sorry, أولئك I believe like وعليهم صلوات من ربهم وأولئك هم المهتدون. Those, but it ends with those, they are the guided. So it actually explicitly connects guidance to them not fearing and grieving. Alaikum salam. So I made a table, or I had to make a table of comparing common causes of fear and grief in the human experience and how God's guidance alleviates the fear and grief. Like I could just I could go through all of them, but just for the sake of time, I'll just take some examples. Like for instance,
I need to head out, but if I can just briefly say something, and then God willing, I can review the recording. Mental health issues are often. Can you mute me, please? Are often related to fear and grief, I think, as well, such as anxiety or depression or things like this. And so, this is a lifelong set of improvement for a believer, but the Quran, as God says, is a healing for what's within the chests. So a believer likely will struggle with these things to some extent on the spectrum, like for example the chart that you see, but then it becomes a way to further submit to God, to trust him more, and then you get more freed of fear and grief, and God willing, you get freed from the ultimate fear and grief, which is the hellfire.
Yeah, mashallah. Example, death of a loved one. Grief may feel like permanent severance and irreversible loss, but the guided, like, counterpoint, the deceased was never outside God's ownership and is returning to him. And furthermore, it's not a permanent loss or irreversible loss. Loss of wealth, fear of poverty, and grief over reduced security or status. Guided principle, which alleviates the fear and grief. God was the provider before the loss and remains the provider afterward. Even you could say like the money was God's anyways. And just like he gave it the first time, he can give it again.
Okay, I have a counter argument of sorts here. So these are all things that can be lost and can be recovered in one way or another. But say dealing with the loss of a loved one, okay, even then you can get another. But what if it's a limb? Say that's your leg, or I don't know, or you lose a finger or a tooth. These things are pretty much reversible, but you will still experience sadness and grief for everything that is impermanent or transient in its physical nature, in its nature. And this is what Surah 112 talks about. So the only way to find refuge is, or the only source of permanence, the only source of stability in it, your only anchor is God. The God is not like anything else, and anything can be lost, whether that loss is temporary. One could pacify themselves with, like, soothe themselves with the idea that that loss is temporary, but then we do have things that can be permanently lost in life. Say you lose a leg, or something, or part of the body. But then, what about like that whole thing, the whole nature of the material world being a source of grief because of its impermanence and changing?
Yeah, that actually makes sense. Like the impermanence of the current world and its inevitable loss, like وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. Man is inevitably in a losing trajectory, and this life is inevitably a losing trajectory, so it's a huge source of grief and fear. People just literally distract themselves from it, but it hits them sooner or later, and when it hits them, it's really severe. But similar to the example you gave, like physical disability, like permanent disability, you would grieve a lot more if your only horizon is this life, so you lack the guidance of the hereafter. But somebody who is aware that they're going to return to God, ultimately they do actually get their ability back, and they only have to endure it for so long, even if you don't get it back in this life. In fact, a lot of loss is not recovered in this life, but that's still okay. So God's guidance is still making it like numbing the fear and the grief. And ultimately, the ultimate state has no fear nor grief. So they get their ability back and more, even from physical disability. Any other thoughts?
Probably in that one is guided, that's an ultimate refuge or appreciation of God. Worship as in recognizing God as your ultimate deity, worthy of worship. Since everything else is going to fail, and God only has the power to create and recreate through you, basically, oh God, everything. So guidance and direction, orientation towards God, that is linked that way. God being your focus in a sense, the object of worship, God being God.
Yeah, another good one I thought of is aging. Aging causes fear and grief, arguably. But for instance, in the guided recognition section, it says strength was never self-generated or permanent. God brought the person from weakness to strength and then to weakness, and the destination remains return to Him. But if you don't have this perspective, there is no positive spin. Like, it's purely just grief. There's nothing good about it. There's no way to view it positively. Brother Saad adds that confrontation or being at the bottom of the road in regards to mental health can often be a form of Allah calling people towards Him and the right path. Yeah, and in general, you could say like the general human fears and grief that are kind of inherent to our experience in this world, arguably, they do sort of call us to God, so to speak, because they beg the solution, and only one solution works. There's only one alleviation, which is God's guidance. Because you can't just remain in a state, I mean, it's really terrible to remain in a state of fear and grief where your only prospect is more fear and grief, increasing fear and grief as time goes on until you're eternally stuck in that state. That's unmanageable. So it begs us to follow His guidance, so to speak, to get us out of this. Any final points? Okay, if not, inshallah, we'll resume tomorrow with our regular verses. We're on verse 40, God willing. So, thank you guys for coming. Inshallah, we'll see ourselves tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much. Till tomorrow.